Today we are going to continue with the Langrisser combat formula, and we are combining some of the smaller topics before we fully move on to the big boys later. And this is the formula again for reference. Today we'll be covering the underlying parts, which are skill multiplier, tick multiplier, and crit modifier. So tick multiplier is just kind of an arbitrary thing, and whoever came up with this just decided to use 10 as the base number for damage calculation. And essentially what we're doing here is we are just dividing this 10 by the number of ticks that our attack is divided into. So for AoE, because the damage is dealt in one full attack, so it's just divided by 1. And for single target attacks for both hero and troops, they do 20 attacks each, so it's divided by 20, which gives you 0.5. And then there are some summons in the game where they will actually do 40 hits. And this is presumably to try to make up for the fact that they don't have troops, but then you're actually just breaking up the damage into smaller parts, so you realistically don't really get much extra damage. And finally, this is just kind of a bit of a trivia, and Hydra's Juggler normal attack does 6 ticks of damage, but then instead of using 10 divided by 6, they just hard-code it to 1.5. Presumably just because they don't want to deal with funny decimals with 1.7 or something, so they just put it to the closest 0.5, which is 1.5. And I'm not sure if there will be a misconception, but just in case, units that attack twice, such as Ledin and Oboro, they will not affect the tick multiplier. The second attack is calculated completely separately, and it will not change the tick multiplier to 0.25. Skill multiplier is very straightforward. It's just what you see on your skill description, and the default is 1 for normal attacks. And troops will always have a skill multiplier of 1 because they only do normal attacks. And I just include Hobo's casting skill here because it's fairly recent, and I'm pretty sure this is the only time that they specifically attach a multiplier to a normal attack, instead of saying, for example, plus 50% damage increase, which would end up being calculated quite differently in the formula. And yeah, so basically it doesn't matter if it's an AoE or single target, you're just taking this multiplier, 1.8 times damage, 0.15 times damage, and that's basically the skill multiplier. So people that watched me play Apex recently will probably notice that I've bitched about this javelin skill more than a few times by now. And just punching some numbers, you can pretty easily see why, because even before we factor in the diminishing returns from damage increase, because you can get it from other sources, if you just times 1.6, you actually get a multiplier of 1.28, which is weaker than Shadow Rage, which is the standard guard ignore skill. And this is actually just some examples of the many legacy skills which has some stupidly low multiplier, but then they give a shit ton of damage increase. And I think these skills came out pretty much where on game release, and they were kind of just doing random shit basically. And slowly these skills are getting phased out. So basically these are the modern version of those skills where they tone back the the low damage part and the high damage increase part. So this is from Ashen, Yenny, and Nemia. So they have a relatively human damage multiplier or skill multiplier, and they also have a relatively human conditional damage increase. And if you do achieve the condition, surprise, you actually get pretty good damage instead of what we had before. And yeah, that's basically all there is for the skill multiplier, and we will move on to crit multiplier, which on the surface looks simple, but there are some caveats to it which you wouldn't really know if you don't dig for info outside of the game. So the very basics of crit in this game is, for heroes, every 10 points of skill you have on your hero equates to 1% of base crit rate. And the default crit damage modifier is 1.3 times damage. And finally, you cannot overcap your crit rate. And what that means is that your crit is capped at 100% before any combat factors, and you cannot overload your crit rate to pre-counter the enemy sources of crit rate reduction, which is usually like a tank command or certain equipment, that sort of thing. So you will always be capped at 100% before taking into account of those negative crit rates. So there is no point in stacking more than 100% crit rate like on your base hero model. Like certain heroes like Zerida, where you basically get 50% crit rate from the talent alone. If you full pump the skill and crit rate arena stone, you will overcap, and it's pointless to do that. So troops are a little bit weird, and there are some probably out there who might not even consider this question, which is, can troops even crit? And the answer is yes, but only if the troop has crit rate. And the way this works is actually pretty similar to what we covered in the last video about post-deploy stats. And this is where there are a bunch of things that benefit both the hero and troops at the same time. And if you can stack up enough of these things, you can even crit cap your troops from 0% base crit rate. So like this is a pretty extreme example, but you can see 107% crit rate if you are using certain troops with certain talents with certain buffs. But otherwise, they technically start at 0 crit rate, because unlike heroes, troops don't have a skill stat. So they're starting at 0, and the only crit rate they have is whatever you can stack on them. So there are some troops that will have a crit rate in their effect, which are usually assassin troops. And this zombie here has 35% crit rate because he was tailor-made to allow Epsilon to have a viable demon troop in PvP basically. So it's random as demon troop has crit chance as well. So hero talents affect troops as well, and here are some examples. So some talents will give you crit rate and crit damage, while others will give you attack and crit rate. So the ones that give crit rate and damage have a higher damage ceiling, but you basically don't have a talent if you don't crit, while the other type tends to be more consistent overall. By the way, if you look at this is Jo and Koni's talent. She's a fairly recent hero, like released around a year ago, I would say. And they still fail to specify crit rate when they say crit. You can see some of this, they will say crit chance, it's crit rate, crit damage. Then for Epsilon, you see crit and crit damage, so their wording is super inconsistent. But basically, I would say crit basically refers to crit rate. And if it's crit damage, they will usually say crit damage. Surprisingly, both active and passive skills will benefit troops as well. And the more surprising one for me was actually active skills. I didn't actually know this beforehand. Because intuitively, you would think the crit bonus that they mentioned on the active skill would be attached to the skill itself, which would only apply to the hero because troops are doing their normal attack while you're using your skill. But no, turns out troop will also fully benefit from the crit bonus if your skill has one as well. And I guess that is one extra reason why Lost Ham runs Repose most of the time, rather than Quicksand Devour, which is his signature Ignore Guard skill. Beyond the lower cooldown, and even though Repose has a lower damage multiplier or skill multiplier, you will get 20% crit, which does benefit your troops, and especially because Lost Ham tends to run Sensi Mercenary, and Sensi Mercenary has no base crit, so this actually helps quite a bit. Buffs will also benefit troops, although crit buffs are much rarer than stat buffs. And we haven't mentioned this in the previous sections, but similarly, all these things apply to troops unless specified otherwise. And in this case, you can see Lina's talent mentions that it is only heroes' crit chance that will be increased. So, similar mechanism. But then again, if I were to be technical, I wouldn't even believe the game description anyways, unless I personally test it, because such is Langrisser Mobile. And just to round out this section, there are certain things that we know for sure that do not apply to troops. And it's basically these things right here. And this might be a bad example because I mentioned yellow enchant 2-piece effect, but the 4-piece effect also does not apply to troops. So yeah, enchants in general don't apply anyway, so yeah, just keep that in mind. Now let's talk a little bit about Arena Mastery, and by a little bit I mean actually a lot, because we're gonna go into a little bit of theory crafting. So Arena Mastery is an extension of Class Mastery that only applies in PvP mode, and on top of the usual stat options, you also get increased and decreased crit modifiers as options. But the numbers are skewed towards the defensive side, which is certainly an interesting game design decision. For me, I don't even care why the defensive options get an extra 10%. I care about why they get 11%. Like, whose idea was it to add that 1% extra on the defensive options? Like, why? Why is the 1 there? Why couldn't they just make it like -20 and -30? Why is it -21 and -31? Anyways, based on what we now know about crit in this game, there are some interesting implications that Arena Mastery brings us. First thing is, if the enemy has maximum crit damage taken Arena Mastery, and you also don't have the increased crit damage option, your crits will effectively do the same damage as non-crits, because the crit modifier is 1.3 and reduced crit damage is 0.3. From a cost-benefit view, if you have to pick between taking reduced crit chance and reduced crit damage, for me it's better to pick reduced crit damage, because even if the enemy has the increased crit damage option, you basically just need to make sure that you survive the 1.2 crit mod on your stats. Then if you can survive the 1.2 crit mod, you actually don't really care whether they crit or not. Whereas if you do it the other way, which is you use the minus crit chance stone instead of minus crit damage, you are gambling that they don't crit, or you're gonna eat a 1.5 crit mod, which can be a way to play the game, but it's obviously less consistent overall. And of course, this is just a general use case without factoring in extra sources of crit damage from talents or whatever, as well as when you factor in procs such as sneak attack, especially for revive units. So finally, stacking crit on accessory and mastery might be a way to score kills that are otherwise not reasonably possible, like you would need a shit ton of damage increase to make a non-crit kill. You can actually just stack crit and then just gamble your way to a kill. And you know, this isn't something you actively plan for, because it's not very easy to get a attack or in plus crit enchant in the first place. But if you do have that option available to you, it might just bail you out of a guaranteed loss situation. Because it really just goes back to the Arena Mastery rules. Normally, if you don't plan to crit, you would just do the standard attack, HP, defense, then double suffered crit. But for me, I thought about it, and what does a non-scaling 45 defense even do for my unit? Most of the time it doesn't really do anything. And we've also just discussed that the suffered crit chance can be dropped if you really want to. Like, you don't really need to have both technically. So if I were to do like attacks or in, then HP, suffered crit damage, crit and crit, then you know, that's another way to play the game, I guess. But even on a mage, you usually have like 100 plus skill and plus the 10% crit rate. You get a base crit of around 20 something percent, even if you don't factor in whether you have a crit enchant or not. And I'll take those odds, because Thorns has a 30% proc chance anyways, but that shit procs like it's 70%. Anyways, back to the topic. Troops not benefiting from Arena Stones also has some pretty interesting implications. Without additional modifiers from talents or buffs, there's actually no point in troops critting the enemy hero if they have max reduced crit damage, because our own increased crit damage from the Arena Stone does not apply to our own troops. However, on the flip side, since the enemy troops do not benefit from reduced crit damage, our hero critting the enemy troops can actually be a viable way of scoring kills, because there's no consistent way to mitigate crit damage for the enemy troops. Conventionally, it's better for troops to hit troops and hero to hit hero, just due to the way numbers work in this game. But when crit gets involved, it might actually be more beneficial for the reverse to happen. Given that skills with fast animations are usually from assassins, who also tend to have high crit rate, you kind of have to stop and think and whether this is a coincidence or they really had this kind of long-term vision. And assassins aside, this is actually the reason for the existence of the Meteor Pendant build for Z2, which normally doesn't make sense, like you only run Pendant on Omega otherwise. And this is because this is the most consistent way for her to one-shot a peak condition Guardian Infantry Lightbringer. It's not guaranteed because Z2 herself doesn't crit cap even with all the crit stacking, and you're still playing against a minus 20% crit chance command, but it's pretty much still better odds than any other existing build. As a final trivia to round off this video, there's actually a tank in the game that has a reduced crit command. Most tanks have a reduced crit chance command, but not crit damage. With reduced crit damage command, you can actually end up doing significantly lesser damage with a crit than without. Unfortunately, this command or this guard skill belongs to Emilia, who is so horribly outclassed by the majority of the other existing tanks that you only build her for waifu reasons. And that's a wrap for this video. Next up would be damage increase. It's only a single topic, but it's a really huge topic with a lot of inconsistent wordings and everything from early on in the game. And given my current upload frequency, only time will tell when I get the next one out. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. See you guys next time. Peace.